Hello, and welcome to The Way to Wow, Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel. I'm going to try and sit up straight, right? Like my mother taught me. This is our regular Tuesday broadcast. We're here every Tuesday, 10:30 a.m. West Pacific Coast time and 1:30 p.m. East Coast time, and an hour in for Central and Mountain time. And our purpose here is to look at military doctrine, military history, great military leaders, and take what they used to effectively fight war and fight wars and engage in combat and lead their troops or their sailors, and turn them into lessons that we can use in our businesses, whether it's our own company or whether we work for an organization. Doesn't really matter. These lessons translate equally well. So they're not all leadership lessons. Some of them are just ideas that we have to wrestle with in order to run a business or run a division of a business successfully. Others of them are more directly leadership oriented. So it's kind of a mixed bag. Having said that, excuse me, I think you will find that these lessons will be useful to you as you deal with the ever-changing climate for business. Pardon me, I'm reminded of something that happened relatively early in my business career. At the time, I was sharing an office with one of my clients, and his father, who was semi-retired, he was probably, as I think about it now, about the age that I am now. He took his son and me out to lunch, and we were just sitting and eating our food and just chatting. And at one point he turned to us and he said, I don't know how you young guys do it. It just, business changes so fast these days. And mind you, this was back, gosh, I think I want to say the early 1990s, maybe the mid 1990s at the latest. And if you can imagine, about 30 years ago, right? And the pace of change has, as we've all experienced, has only gotten greater. It seems like the challenges have gotten greater. Things are more complex. And so it takes a lot more thought and I would argue a lot more courage to run a business these days. And that's why I launched this particular program. I think there are more similarities between warfighting doctrine and running a business today, perhaps than ever, excuse me, even though I do not equate running a business to the kind of existential situation that that people face in combat. Coming out of World War II, it was an interesting time because so many people had been in the military and or connected with the military and the government and or large organizations providing materiel for the war effort. So the idea of working in a disciplined environment, in a chain of command, so to speak, a hierarchical organization, didn't faze them, I think, nearly as much as it does now. And yet within those organizations, because of how things worked on the battlefield for American forces, I think they naturally did certain things that perhaps today we're less likely to do. So what I mean by that is one of the hallmarks of American success in World War II was the initiative taken by what are called non-commissioned officers. So all branches of the military are basically separated into three sort of classes, if you will, of personnel. So there's enlisted personnel, There are what are called warrant officers, and warrant officers carried what was called a warrant, hence the name. And a warrant was different than the third group, which was the leadership group called commissioned officers. So commissioned officers were commissioned by the sovereign. So in England, that was the king or queen. In the United States, that was essentially the federal government, which derives its power from the sovereign, the people in this country. Whereas warrant officers were given a piece of paper, a warrant, if you will. And the fact of the matter is, the number of officers, warrant and commissioned in the various branches, was small percentage-wise relative to the number of enlisted personnel. And the enlisted personnel were basically divided into three groups. There was the sort of basic enlisted people, the soldiers, the Marines, the seamen, the airmen. Then there was what are called, I lost the term. I was non-commissioned officers, NCOs. So in the Navy, this is petty officers, third through first class. In the Army and the Marine Corps, it's corporals and sergeants. Okay. And then the highest level of enlisted officer were what are called SNCOs, senior non-commissioned officers. Okay, so that would be a staff sergeant or above in the Army and Marine Corps. In the Navy, it was chief petty officers. And the thing about these senior non-commissioned officers is they had typically been in the military for quite some time. They had a lot of experience, not just training more junior people, but also training junior officers. Okay, now they didn't train warrant officers, by the way. Typically, warrant officers were enlisted people with a lot of experience who were then sort of elevated to this rank of warrant officer. They had a particular technical specialty, and that's why they were made a warrant officer. They were in some ways relieved from the training duties that a senior non-commissioned officer had. And it was the ability to train and lead that made by senior non-commissioned officers that made the American military so effective. And so you would have a sergeant who might be in his, late 30s, and he's dealing with his platoon commander who, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say a sergeant. Maybe he probably was like a staff sergeant or perhaps a technical sergeant. And he was dealing with his platoon commander, who might be a literally 22-year-old first lieutenant. And the culture of the Army was such that that pretty green first lieutenant would know to look to that seasoned staff sergeant in order to understand better what he needed to do, how he needed to act, the decisions he needed to make. And oftentimes that, when all was said and done, it was that staff sergeant who was exercising the combat, the sort of minute by minute combat leadership. So there was a sense of ideas moving throughout the ranks, and the taking of initiative, even by, in theory, more junior people. They were junior in that they were senior non-commissioned officers as opposed to commissioned officers, but they weren't junior in years or experience. And so that all worked pretty well. But as we moved out of the World War II era, and these hierarchies continued to exist in business, people didn't have that experience, that battlefield experience anymore. And so these hierarchies hardened in a way that more junior people felt less comfortable, I think, voicing ideas for improvement, and more senior people were less open to hearing them. They hadn't been, they didn't have a test of fire in that culture. And eventually, I think, and this is, for example, if you look at what happened with the automobile industry in the 1970s, where it fell way behind its German and Japanese competitors. I think that's one of the reasons why, is that there was a loss of this interflow of or interchange of ideas from the people who are actually executing the mission, building the cars, getting up to the leadership ranks, and the leadership ranks are thinking, hey, I know what I'm doing. I don't need to hear from these people. Okay. Now, if you were to go into the military during those times, it was a much smaller military, of course, than during World War II. But that exchange was still taking place. It's just as people left the military in the 60s and into the 70s, there just weren't enough of them to maintain that culture within the larger civilian culture, the way there had been post-World War II, and to a much lesser extent, even post-Korean War, where a lot of the people in Korea had fought during World War II as well. So I think that there's a lot to be learned by looking at how the military branches operate, what their doctrines are, et cetera. And so I just, I thought I'd kind of throw a little bit of that history out there. I'm a history buff. I hope you find those kind of things interesting, and perhaps those stories will encourage you to investigate more, do some reading about military history. And I'll give a plug for the Society of Military History. The president of the Society of Military History, SMH, is a friend of mine, Jennifer Spielman, a very, very talented professor at the Merchant Marine Academy. And actually, Jennifer was a guest on my other show on Wednesday, the Way to Wow, People Making Money. And had a number of great ideas. Again, she's coming out of the immersion in, well, I mean, the merchant marine is not the military per se, but it runs in a fairly significantly similar way. And so Jennifer, being immersed in that environment, brought that perspective to many of the things she talked about. So I invite you to go to our YouTube channel, youtube.com at the Way to Wow Show, I think is our URL, and check out Jennifer's show. And in fact, shameless plug, right? Do subscribe, and I think you will find you'll learn quite a bit by looking at past episodes as well as viewing upcoming episodes. So so for today's topic, we're continuing examining Marine Corps warfighting doctrine, and I'm chuckling because last week I continued with what I thought was the second presentation of some information on various principles. And after I got done with that, I looked back and I realized, oops, I hadn't done the first one. So I'm gonna jump back and do the first part that I missed. And so last week's show is out of order for this one, unfortunately. But listen, what can I say? I guess you could call it a senior moment, right? That's just how it goes sometimes. Let's get the show going here. Okay, so in any event, here's our PowerPoint presentation that I used last week. Only this time we're not going to skip the first lesson. Oops, what did I do here? There we go. So we're talking about the nature of business now. Oh, wait, I think I skipped something. Yeah, there we go. So, as always, and I'm not going to cover this in any depth, but all of what I do is based on the 3 pillars of attainment. So you can look at previous episodes if you want a more in-depth explanation of what that's all about. I want to get into the nature of business. So last week I dealt with fluidity and disorder, thinking I had already covered friction and uncertainty, but indeed I hadn't. So I'm going to talk about in terms of the nature of business, which comes from the nature of warfare, friction and uncertainty. So friction, as the word means, is things don't go smoothly, right? There is things that if you've ever tried to drag a big rock across dirt, it doesn't go so smoothly because the friction between the rock and the dirt slows you down. There's ridges on the rock that dig into the dirt that slow you down, and those kind of things, as opposed to, if you can picture, an old time plow from the 1800s. That steel blade was made to cut furrows in the ground with the least amount of friction possible. So we'd like to have our businesses acting as if they're that plow, making that neat, very low friction cut into the business world. But the reality is that's just not how business works. So we have to deal with the fact that oftentimes there are things going on in the business that are not going to go smoothly. And rather than, kind of wishing and hoping that the friction will go away, we're much better dealing with the reality of the friction and putting processes into place for overcoming that friction as best and as quickly as possible. Okay, so I was having a conversation with a friend of mine last night about this, and one of the things that we were talking about is sometimes we let our niceness get in the way of really what I would say is being kind, but also being effective in our businesses. So there might be an employee that we have who really just they're in the wrong position. They're unable to handle some aspect of their job, maybe the leadership aspect, maybe the creative aspect. And yet we hold on to them because we feel like, well, maybe they'll grow into the job, or they'll mature and become a better leader. And the reality is, hoping and wishing is not a good way to overcome friction, right? We either need to get that employee training and real training that solves the root of whatever is holding that employee back, or we need to do one of two other things. We need to put the employee in a different position or let the employee go. It's not helpful for the business to keep the employee because the employee is creating friction that makes it harder for everybody else. It's not good for our other employees to witness that there's this, weak link, if you will, in the chain, or there's this cog that is consistently seeming to sort of gum up the works, and that person is held on to and makes their jobs harder, and yet is really, and it's making their jobs harder, right? And so why is this person here? But it's also not good for the employee himself. So to keep someone in a position that they're just not appropriate for is stunting their growth. Okay, we either need to help them grow into the position or let them go, and hopefully they will either what we were doing wasn't motivation enough for them to grow in that particular area, or maybe it's just not something they're interested in doing. And so forcing them to stay in that job and deal with issues that they just don't want to deal with, that's not kind at all. It's this kind of slow torture almost, obviously not literally, but better to let them move on and find something they're better suited for that they can enjoy more, rather than keeping them there. And indeed, if we were to put this back in a military context for a minute, think about having someone in a combat unit who is unable to either exercise the kind of leadership that is needed in combat or exercise the technical skill. Maybe they launch mortars, or they handle a shoulder launch shoulder launch missiles or something, and they're just not able to do it. Or maybe they deal with communications and they can't deal with the complexity. Is it helping anybody out for that person to be in that job? And the answer is no, right? Because they're putting their own life in danger, they're putting the lives of their colleagues in danger, et cetera. So we can see in that case where literally lives could be lost, we would probably pretty quickly recognize, look, we got to get this person out of here, that we've got to put them in a different job, or they just need to leave the military. We're less likely to do that in business, and that may be okay, as long as we're actively working to help the person make up their deficiencies. But that can only go on for so long. And then the person has got to be reassigned or let go. Okay. And that's just how we have to deal with friction, if the friction in that, is coming from a particular individual. So I'm looking here at the Marine Corps Warfighting Manual. So I want to give you a couple of examples of other types of friction, and I didn't want to miss any of these because I think they're so interesting. So I'm going to actually just read you a little bit of. So friction may be mental, as in indecision, right? And the friend I was talking with last night, that was that we were talking about that as an issue, that we didn't talk about it in the context of friction. But when you think about it, indecision on the part of leadership causes friction, and the longer the indecision goes on, especially once people have broadly seen that there's a problem here that needs to be dealt with, the longer the indecision goes on, the more friction is created, right? And so one of the best ways to reduce friction is to overcome indecision, right? And that, by the way, is going to lead into our next topic, which is uncertainty, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So it can also be physical. There can be physical types of friction. So, for example, in warfighting doctrine, they use enemy fire, like you're having bullets coming at you. That certainly creates friction. We probably don't have that in the business world. Hopefully not. I'm sorry, I stray thought. I was thinking, unless we work in the post office, God forbid. But we can have physical friction. For example, if we have too small a workplace, or a workplace that is not set up to accommodate the activities that need to happen there, so people are constantly almost fighting against their physical environment as they're trying to get their work done, and it's very, very difficult. So for a long time, it was thought that these open work floor plans were great for productivity because people could interact more readily and all that kind of stuff. And more recent research has shown that indeed these open workspace plans are actually counterproductive to productivity, because what they encourage is interruptions to people working and that sort of thing, right? So there again, we've got physical friction, a physical issue creating friction in the workplace. So the friction can be external. So that might be our competition. They're creating friction for us. If they've got a product that's better than what we're selling, so that's going to create friction for us. Or if they've got a more efficient way to deliver their product, again, that's creating friction for us, because people are more likely to gravitate toward our competitor than our business, right? But it can also be self-induced, and I think this is a very cogent point, in that if we're not clear what we're trying to accomplish, we've created friction by that lack of clarity, right? Because people come to work each day and it's like, okay, well, I guess I'm shipping stuff out today. I guess, but then if a problem comes up, there's no basis from which to prioritize and determine how best to solve the problem, because the goal for the company is not clear, right? So the more clear our mission, the clearer our goals, and the better we communicate that to the people we work with, the less self-induced friction we'll have. Okay. And I would, as I have on other shows, a lot of dealing with the nature of business does come down to leadership. So part of, and one of the big parts of leadership is recognizing where is there friction and how can I help my people deal with that friction, hopefully overcome it, maybe eradicate it, although we're not going to eradicate friction. It is a constant in business, because once we take care of friction in one area, it's going to arise in another because the business environment changes. Okay, so it's that ongoing pursuit of reduction of friction that is a key aspect of leadership. Okay, so friction, I think, is one of the most important qualities of the nature of business that we should wrestle with. And the more quickly we can identify it in our businesses, obviously the faster we can get to solving it. Okay, and as we create that sort of identification solution cycle, right? We want to try and shorten the length of time to run through that cycle as best we can. Okay, all right. So let's now go to uncertainty. So uncertainty is the reality that no matter what we do, we are not going to know exactly what our competition is doing, what every aspect of our company is doing, how people are going to respond in a given situation. Uncertainty is just a given, because in the end, we're human beings. Okay? And even if we've known someone for a long, long time, they may still respond in a way that we don't anticipate. And certainly people we don't know well, or people who are our competitors, they're going to, in some cases, do their best to hide how they're going to respond, or even trick is the wrong word, but mislead, like sort of put out sort of false signals here and there, so we think, oh, they're going to go over this way, and then the next thing we know, they're going in this other direction. So uncertainty is an issue that, again, we just have to resign ourselves to it and deal with it as best we can. And this is where this idea of mental friction, indecision being one of them, relates directly to uncertainty. Oftentimes, right, indecision comes from uncertainty. Well, if we only analyze this more, if we only collect more data, if we only do this, if we only do that, let's just wait a little bit longer, right? And then the picture will become clearer. It might, but something else might happen that will cause the picture to get fuzzier. We can't be sure that the view will come into greater focus if we wait longer. And oftentimes, what we need to do is make a good decision rather than delay trying to make the best decision, or even worse, the perfect decision. There is no perfect decision, right? And you've probably heard the old saying, perfect is the enemy of the good and the better, right? What we want to strive for is good and improvement always, especially in our decision making. Okay, we're much better off after having given reasonable consideration to the various issues that are confronting us, making a decision, moving forward, and then collecting feedback on how that decision is working. And then if we have to, we can modify that decision, okay? Or we may need to retract it and decide something else, okay? That's not a sign of weakness. It feels like it viscerally, right? Oh my gosh, I made a mistake. But it's a very, very powerful aspect of leadership to essentially say to your people, look, I made the best decision I could at the time in order to help us move forward. Turned out not to be the right decision. So now I think we need to change. You know, I've gotten input from a lot of people. Now we need to change directions. Okay. And I would say, by the way, that this is one reason why sort of I'm making big public announcements and all that kind of stuff is oftentimes counterproductive, because now a company publicly appears to be committed to a particular decision, and for the constituencies that want that decision, whether it's good for the company or not, if we have to then change it, we risk alienating those people. So I think businesses would be better off keeping their own counsel, so to speak, and having a culture where we're striving to get better even as we make decisions, and even as we try to, I should say, overcome indecision and make decisions in a timely fashion that allow us to move forward, knowing that oftentimes we're not going to be going in the exact direction we hope to go. We're going to be kind of over here, and so we're going to have to correct and come back over here. It's like the old idea of the airplane flying from Los Angeles to Hawaii. Rarely is the airplane actually pointed directly at Honolulu. Typically, it's making a path that goes like this, and there's a constant series of corrections that keep the plane going in the direction of Honolulu, okay, but never aimed directly, or rarely aimed directly at it because of wind and various other forces that are acting on the airplane. That's the same thing is true of our businesses. So friction and uncertainty are two aspects of the nature of business. The more comfortable we can become with their existence, as opposed to trying to eradicate them, the better we'll be. So that's what I have for you today. And like I said, if you're watching the show now, you can now go back to last week's show where I talk about the next two, fluidity and disorder. And you'll see I talk about them and say, well, last week we covered these two, and forgetting that I hadn't. But you'll see then how fluidity and disorder connect in terms of, again, the nature of business. And you see, again, the fluidity and disorder are a natural part of business. They're not going to go away. They just keep going on. And that's why I call this the nature of business. It's just how business is, right? It's like, deer want to run, giraffes have tall necks, flies buzz around. It's the nature of these animals. And there's a nature of business as well. And for the most part, we're not going to change it, because it comes from just the way things are among humans, right? Business is in the end a human endeavor. And so we just have to learn to deal with that, rather than, hope and wish that, that it will change. So that's our show for today. I went a little bit over time, but hopefully you got some good ideas out of this. If you have any thoughts about what I said, please drop a comment in any of the social media sites that you may be watching this on, or put a comment in the YouTube, the YouTube comments if you're watching this on our YouTube channel. And if it's a question you have, I'm happy to respond to your questions. Would love to. and indeed may, bring the question up in a succeeding show, unless you don't want me to. So say, don't bring this up, but that kind of thing. But I think to share your questions will help other people. When I was teaching in the classroom, I would tell people there are no dumb questions, which isn't precisely correct, but it's probably 95% correct. You may get dumb answers. That's absolutely a possibility. But no dumb questions. And typically what I found is if one of my students had a question and was courageous enough to ask the question, I'd see, usually about 10% of the people in the room at least kind of going, yeah, that's a good question. I wish I need to know that, right? So you're helping other people out if you bring your questions to light. So thank you very much for joining me today. And remember my other show on Wednesdays, 12:30 Pacific time, 3:30 Eastern time, the Way to Wow show, People Making Money, where we talk to people about their interesting careers and or talk about various aspects of finding a career or starting a business that you can really enjoy. And that's every Wednesday. And I will be back here next Tuesday, 10:30 a.m. Pacific, 1:30 p.m. Eastern for the Way to Wow show, business lessons from the military. So thanks again for watching. Wishing you a wonderful week. And as I always do, sign off by saying, Marie, darling, you are my belle. Take care now.